Hello, and welcome to another episode of Monster Monday from the Ready to Die channel. Using the rules for making monsters in Pathfinder Second Edition, I build stat blocks for creatures in my own games and to share with the community. I also operate a blog where these stat blocks can be found alongside a Pathfinder First Edition and D&D 5e version, which is linked below along with the Monster Monday Twitter and Discord. In today's video, we return to the world of Wild Hearts for the magnetism manipulating monster, the Gritdog. Otherwise known as the Suno Suzumi, the Gritdog is one of the few kimono from Wild Hearts not infused with plants, but with earth and matter instead. In particular, it is described as being equipped with lodestones that allow it to control magnetic fields. In-game, it primarily uses this power to shape and strike with iron sand. It is another early encounter in Wild Hearts, but I gave it a bit more oomph in the interest of diversifying builds, and thus built it as a level 6 monster. The Gritdog is a shockingly intelligent creature, showing tool use and creation by manipulating its iron sand to craft simple structures and objects, even mimicking some of the Karakuri structures that players can make in-game. This influenced my decision to grant it the Beast trait, which as I mentioned in the past, is defined by at least a modicum of intellect. The Gritdog is one of those creatures that doesn't fit in any particular design roadmap, leaving me to figure out the route on my own. Ability-wise, I leaned into its general burliness, building with a high constitution for its primary ability score. It seems to favor using its powers, relying on the lodestones within its body to manipulate magnetic forces. This, along with the kineticists relying on constitution to control similar forces, also helped influence this decision. When using attacks outside of manipulating its iron sand, it seems to rely on force rather than finesse, so it has a moderate strength while the rest of its ability scores are lower. With an intelligence modifier -3, it has the lowest intellect it can have as a beast. It has a moderate bonus to its crafting skill, given the Gritdog's ability to create items and structures out of its sand. I would have liked a higher bonus, but struggled to justify it given its lower intellect. Dark vision is not something that all beasts necessarily have, but I specifically included for the Gritdog since raccoons, its base animal, are nocturnal. With that high constitution, it probably doesn't come as much of a surprise that it has a high hit point value as well, but it is also a big target. It demonstrates some agility with the way that it jumps and bounds about, but isn't terribly nimble when it comes to dodging attacks. So to balance out this sizable health pool, our furry Ferris friend here has a moderate armor class. Additionally, it has that high con, so it will of course use a high fortitude bonus, whereas its dexterity is lower, so its reflex save is only a moderate bonus. Finally, it has a terrible will save, primarily to ensure it has another weakness for the players to exploit. In Wild Hearts, the Gritdog is weak to the wind and wood elements. The latter is a little difficult to include in Pathfinder 2e. Maybe when Rage of Elements releases, it'll have something to suit it better, and I think I saw some stuff relating poison damage to the wood element, but until then I'm leaning into the wind weakness, which is often associated with electricity as a damage type. I mentioned earlier that Gritdog seems to rely more on its abilities, but will intersperse its use of its sand with swings from its Morning Star of a tail or quick swipes from its claws. Both of these strikes use a moderate bonus since its attacks are more of a secondary thing. The only trait on its claws is Agile, which is pretty standard, and so they will use a moderate damage bonus, giving them some oomph. Its large bushy tail is studded with spikes formed from its iron sand, so while it normally deals bludgeoning damage, it also has the versatile trait for piercing and the usual reach. I'm not sure if they actually assign the Gritdog a sand value that is consumed by abilities in Wild Hearts, but the creature periodically has to gather up more sand between using its powers. This was a neat concept and one that I wanted to play with, instead of just using the typical cooldowns. To that end, its abilities run off of its ferrous sand, that ends up functioning somewhat akin to focus points with certain abilities costing it sand points to use. It can refresh its sand points with its draw and sand activity. Hunting notes for the game mentioned that attacking it while it's doing so is a solid strategy, which I sought to represent with the inclusion of the Manipulate trait. With a ferrous sand having 3 points, it was easy to have this be a variable action activity, with each additional action spent regaining an additional sand point. When it comes to actually spending these sand points, the Gritdog has a few options. I'll start with the one related to the strikes we just discussed, Forge Tail. For a single sand point in one action, the Gritdog can adapt to face whatever situation it is in by adding different traits to its tail. This actually only really references the Gritdog's enraged form where its tail erupts into a cluster of swords, but I thought it was an overall fun concept and I wanted to expand upon it. I did represent this bouquet of blackened blades with a damage increase granted by the effect you get from spending 2 sand points on this ability, which gives it extreme damage value on its tail for the duration. From what I saw, the Grizzly Gritdog relies on a lot of raising iron spikes from the ground, but will mix up the pattern in which it does so. To that end, Erupting Spikes is a pretty standard AoE ability that the Gritdog can choose the shape of between a line, a cone, or an emanation. This ability uses a high DC, which is pretty standard for an effect like this, but I was a little torn on the damage for it. On the one hand, it has to spend a sand point to use it, but it can do so 3 times before needing to take any sort of break. I ended up leaning a bit towards the higher side of suggested area damage, but didn't go the full way. Its other damaging ability, which is a little more expensive to use, is its Steel Drum Belly. I'm not entirely certain how this is supposed to work in Wild Hearts, but sometimes the Gritdog sits back and starts beating its Parumpapum-Tum, which draws in hunters. It finishes off this drum solo with a final slam that deals significant damage and sends hunters flying back. I don't know why, but I kind of like vacuum abilities, so I was happy to work this in. Effects of this nature give the heroes 2 chances to avoid it, so the initial pool uses a DC between high and extreme. The damage itself is just a high DC, but its value is also higher to account for the expenditure of 2 sand points, and also to differentiate it from its erupting spikes. I'm not even sure what causes the damage in game, so I leaned into the idea of it just being the sound itself and built it as sonic damage. In addition to the damaging areas it creates, the Gritdog has some utility built into its kit with its Wall of Iron Sand. This is a little bit better than most wall spells, being only 2 actions, but does use up 2 of the Gritdog's sand points. I sought to keep the health of the wall a bit lower, and while it wasn't super effective in the test, it was largely because I had the encounter take place on an iron sand beach. This isn't an uncommon environment for a Gritdog to be in, but it isn't one where the wall is super effective. The Gritdog can also be found in canyons and valleys, or wherever you want to put it, where the wall might be a bit more useful, so it was hard for me to really gauge the effectiveness. One thing I will say is that it at least slowed down the party and kept the Gritdog alive for a few more turns. Since I still don't entirely understand Wild Heart's gear, I went with an original idea for its item. I really wanted to play into the magnetism powers as well as the sand that the Gritdog wields, so I came up with the Gourd of Black Sand. This is a held item, a bit of a break from my usual fare, that has 2 effects. It can limitlessly exert its magnetic power to create the effects of a mage hand, but only with metal items. But its main ability is to cover enemies in iron sand that draws metallic and electrical effects towards the target. This effect is based off of the Charged Javelin spell, mostly just because I think it's a super neat effect. In my initial ideation for this item and its design, the critical failure increased the penalty and bonus, but it was pointed out that that was a bit too strong. So instead, I went for a slowed effect, based on the idea that the metal is clinging together and making it difficult to move. This brings us to the end of our discussion on the mischievous magnetic mammal whose mastery over metal might massacre you and your mates. It can adapt to encounters by forging its tail for the situation, and is actually highly capable at battlefield control. It can match its erupting spikes to enemy formations, draw in adversaries closer with the steel belly drum, and then seal off their escape with its wall of iron sand. The test didn't quite go this way, but I'm still pretty happy with how this crafty critter turned out. You can check out the Monster Monday blog and Twitter for the stat blocks, or hop on the Discord to join the monster making and general tabletop discussions. These posts also include a Pathfinder First Edition version of the monster, along with a D&D 5e conversion. Thanks for watching, and have a monstrous Monday.